I could just affirm
Yeah,
that.
please.
I want to also affirm, like, I feel like a lot of what's happened is finding like what is the role to play in movement, like what are the things, and I love what you're talking about of like going from like, wait, where am I, to like, oh, here I am, and like how I feel like you've done such a beautiful job of holding that complex line of like, I'm an artist and I'm an activist, like I'm an organizer and I'm I'm a poet. You're gonna have to always contend with me as a poet in addition to everything else, and that's such an it's constantly inspiring to just be like, oh right, like I don't have to set my artist self in the back seat like of my life, like it all gets to be here, but also I feel like so many of us around the table have been responsible for also thinking about what is movement work beyond organizing, like door knocking organizing. It's like, oh, that's a crucial component of movement work, but I feel like in the past decade my mind has really expanded around like, oh, everyone in every place needs to be radicalized, and everyone in every place, needs to be finding a way to then be contributing towards a different future, and what my way might be has to suit all the different gifts that I have. It won't work if I try to operate in someone else's gift box, that.
Well, I do want to affirm,
Yeah.
because what we talked about in the last time was the need for new language, and how much new language we have created.
Yes.
And really your work in poetry and
Doing it.
the whole digital justice conceptualism. I mean, all of that has given us a way to name, to identify, to recognize, to aim for.
Yes.
Thinking differently.
Yeah.
And especially a lot of the work around emergence in terms of thinking not in mechanical terms, but in biological terms. And that's been that's a tremendous shift for all of us.
Well, and it was, again, it's like Grace had that, that Margaret Wheatley connection, right? And I was like, oh, when did that happen? I was trying to remember. I was like, when did it was around that time. And I feel like we were downstairs in her living room, and at least for me, she was just like, wait, no, midwifing the movement. And then also, she just had these little moments of just like, have you heard of this? And that idea of like, have I heard of emergence? And just being like, it's not just emergence. For me, it's that idea of like, oh, I see a lot of people actually moving this way. Detroit moves this way. We move, there's a way of moving in right relationship, like a flock of birds, and then falling out of right relationship, and we can feel when that happens. I think also this past decade we lost Charity Hicks, one of our water warriors, and what it felt like to realize how much of a leader she was in our flock, and how disorienting it was to suddenly not have her presence with us. I think about that. I'm like, oh, she gave language too. Like I think about her talking about us getting naked, and and just being like, that's still to this day. Like when I'm in a movement space, and I'm like, we're not comfortable getting naked here. Like we're not saying what we really think and feel. But I feel like that. I tell that people all the time. I'm like, I didn't come up with these ideas. I'm in a community of people who are observing what's happening and trying to find language for it. Wage love. I'm like, if you need to understand what you're trying to do in this life, wage love. Right. That's what you're trying to do.
The first ever, at least that I know of in our Detroit movement community, the first ever ritualization of and prayer for charity.
Yes.
Which you had a big role in organizing, right, Adela?
Yes.
Big circle at the Commons, just real innovation. Not just talking about spirit and struggle, but doing it, making it, creating it.
That's right.
And that was a really important moment, very important moment.
And it's also making me think about language. I was just in a dialogue the other day about how charity did hold so much, like you just said, so much language. And like I'm looking at the climate justice movement as an example, and I keep asking, like, why am I not hearing the term environmental racism anymore? Like when I entered that space and charity was there, it was central. And now I might hear it occasionally. And so I just took notice of the fact that she was just very intentional about centering like Black Detroit, children, Black women,
and the language of truth.
And the language, I just felt like when she joined the Ancestors, Grace, Ron Scott, you know, Coalition Against Police Brutality, and Ollie is a lot more. Yeah, it's just been so many, and but contemporaneously with losing them, it was like, oh, so much grief. But then because my consciousness had been raised at the same time, it was like, wow, I can still communicate with them, and I feel like I've been tapping into all of them so often, you know. And it's been tremendous in like the moments where I'm just fearful in particular struggle, as an example, or don't feel like I'm equipped to, you know, be in a particular space. And then I'll just go back like organic intellectual, what? Anyway, so I got this, you know. And Grace really did create that environment. I didn't get a chance to meet Jimmy, but Grace really did create that environment along with Shay and all the Boggs board members to like feel like you have authentic voice and can contribute, and you don't have to come from any, you know, higher up institution in order to be valued.
That's right.
You know,
That's right.
which makes a difference.
There's something that's bubbling up for me.
Yes.
In the past roundtable conversation, I believe Shay spoke to this, but Grace was talking about it too, how we were trying to figure out how to even make the internal work.
Yes.
You know, and so to make the internal work, then to think about taking that statewide and then nationally and then internationally just felt in some ways daunting. And yet here we are 10 years later and so much of that is happening. And I heard it called like the morphic field, right? The stuff that's bubbling up underneath, that one or two people may be saying ahead of time, but that it's already been happening, like you were saying, in communities, and we've been having these smaller conversations that start brewing and then become the field. And so we're sitting in the field.
It is. I think of it like, so that's the mycelial network too. Like that's that like, oh, something massive grows underground, and then we start to see little, oh, there's
Shoots
image,
coming
there's
up.
shoots, there's something, it's alive. But it's like, oh, the size of it is not like this candle wick, it's the candle, it's the table, it's the world, you know? And it feels like that it's been that kind of thing of like, oh, so many people, you know, the number one thing that people tell me about emergent strategies, they're like, I've always known this. I've always felt this. My grandmother knew this. This is what my, you know, the oldest people I can know, that's what we knew. That's what we thought. And I'm like, right. But for me as a Black person who was displaced from all that lineage, you know, I've had to find it through spirit and find it through prayer and find it through studying and trying to figure out like, oh, what might people from where I maybe came from have thought or known, right? And that re-indigenization process for me was so much of what writing that was about. But that's what people say is they're like, I've known that, I just didn't have the words. And now that I have a language for it, and Detroit is like that. We'd be popping out the words for folks. We'd be giving folks, here's what you're trying to do.
Right.
I still think that, you know, Detroit is still what everyone else is looking forward to. Although now it does feel like, I will say another thing that feels like it's shifted in the last 10 years is the catching, like I feel like there's a lot of places now that I'm like, we're in a relationship with New Orleans in a certain way. We're in a relationship, there's like sister cities, sister places. Puerto Rico, Chicago, you know, Durham. Like there's these places where, you know, for folks who've been flowing in and out through the Allied Media Conference and through other formations, I'm just like, oh, I see so many people now awakening to like, oh, we, like Detroit, have to pay attention to what's happening underground, have to like give more attention to the shoots and not, you know, dismiss them as I think people can do easily. Yeah.